the 16th lecture on the book of John. Today's message is from John chapter 18. The title of the chapter is Jesus is Arrested. Here are the main points. First, the prayer in Gethsemane, verses 1 and 2. Second, Jesus' boldness and his love, verses 3 to 9. Third, Jesus drinks the cup that the Father has given him, verses 10 to 12. Fourth, two disciples follow Jesus to the place where he is judged, verses 13 to 18. Fifth, Jesus is questioned, verses 19 to 40. Verse 1, let us read. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his... The Kidron is a brook that lies to the east of Jerusalem. It is a small brook located between Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives. The garden in the verse refers to the Garden of Gethsemane. The Gethsemane garden is in the Mount of Olives. Jesus sometimes went there with his disciples to pray. This time, Jesus prayed earnestly with the cross ahead of him. This was a place at which Jesus prayed with his disciples, a place where they gathered. Verse 3. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Judas Iscariot, along with some officers from the chief priests, to arrest Jesus. He also brought with him a band of Roman soldiers. The Roman soldiers represent the powers of the world. The chief priests and the Pharisees are corrupt religious men. The officers whom they sent came with Judas Iscariot to arrest Jesus. The powers of the world and corrupt religious men always work together to persecute the true church of Christianity. That is why the Roman soldiers sent by Pilate and the officers sent by the Pharisees came to arrest Jesus. They came to arrest the Son, Jesus, as if they were arresting a robber. They are people who trust in the powers and forces of the world. In verse 4, Jesus asked, "Whom do you seek?" Jesus to avoid on the cross. Verses 5 and 6. They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. When Jesus said to those who came to arrest him, "I am he," they all fell to the ground. they surrendered before Jesus' authority and God's power. Jesus laid down his life and followed his good conscience when he acted. The Lord lived according to God's will, and he was empowered by the power of God. Verses 7 and 8. So he asked them again, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So see these men go." Jesus said, "Let these men go." Jesus loved and protected his disciples. He loved them infinitely as he gave himself to die. Verse 9. This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken. "Of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one." Jesus protected his disciples. He fulfilled the words in chapter 17, verse 12. Verse 10. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Peter was by nature short-tempered. He loved the Lord and had a faithful heart. It was for this reason that he took out his sword and cut off Malchus. Truth is, Peter, in his anger, wanted to kill Malchus. However, he missed, so he only cut off his ear. Peter was wrong in doing this. He was trying to fight with the sword in flesh and blood. Our fight is not against flesh and blood. We are fighting a spiritual fight. Therefore, if we try to fight in flesh and blood, we fail. Verse 11. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?" In Luke chapter 22, verse 51, Jesus tells Peter to do no more of this. Jesus touched Malchus' ear and healed it. He said, "Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?" Jesus knew this cup. The cup refers to the suffering on the cross that the Father has given Jesus. That is why Jesus is sold by Judas Iscariot. That is why Jesus does not hate the people. The Lord does not hate people. He accepted the cup knowing it came from God. The chief priests and Pharisees, in their jealousy, tried to arrest Jesus and kill him. Pontius Pilate held an unfair trial. Still, Jesus did not hate them or criticize them. The Lord accepted the Father's cup. We too must accept the cup of suffering, slander, and hardship. We must accept these things knowing that they come from God. The chief priests and the officers arrested Jesus, bound him, and took him away. The disciple ran away. Matthew chapter 26, verse 56. Verse 13. First they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Annas was high priest from 7 AD to 14 AD. After his time, his son took the role of high priest. The next high priest was Caiaphas, who was Annas' son-in-law. Caiaphas was high priest from 18 AD to 36 AD. Verse 14. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. In the council, Caiaphas had prophesied about Jesus. Chapter 11, verses 49 to 52. Verse 15. And so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. Every one of the disciples had run away in the garden. Peter, however, followed Jesus, who was bound up and arrested. He followed from afar. Matthew chapter 26, verse 58. Mark chapter 14, verse 54. The another disciple is the Apostle John. The Apostle John's mother, Salome, is the Virgin Mary's relative. Chapter 19, verse 25. Mark chapter 15, verse 40. They were relatives of the wife of Zechariah, who was priest. They were relatives of Zechariah's wife, Elizabeth. Luke chapter 1, verse 5 and verse 36. The Apostle John was closely related to his family. Because he had close ties with the priest, he was able to enter the courtyard. Verse 16. But Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door, and he brought Peter in. Peter could not enter, so he stood outside the door. The Apostle John requested to the servant girl that Peter be brought in, and Peter was brought into the courtyard. He didn't enter as Jesus' disciple, but as a spectator. Verse 17. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." The servant girl at the door asked Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" At this, Peter denied Jesus to the servant girl. He loved his life more than he loved Jesus. Peter still loved his life more. His life was his idol. Peter also shared a charcoal fire with them, warming himself with the officers. Peter, as a spectator, warmed himself alongside the officers. Verses 19 and 20. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. The high priest questioned Jesus about his teaching. Jesus had already clearly told them about his teaching. The Lord publicly and taught in the temple. Jesus had not said anything in secret. He openly and publicly spoke the word of God. He clearly bore witness to the fact that he is Christ. Verse 22. When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, Is that how you answer the high priest? The high priest must judge in accordance with the truth. However, he did not judge fairly, nor did he do it according to the truth. Furthermore, an officer of the high priest struck Jesus with his hand. Jesus was telling the truth. The corrupt religious men made an unjust judgment. The officers blindly behaved as the priest's agents. The high priest, without any reason, the officer struck Jesus. Verse 23. Jesus answered him, If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? Jesus did nothing wrong. Even still, the officer hit Jesus. There needs to be a standard for judging and punishing a person. This standard and truth must be the law. However, these people wrongly judged Jesus because of their emotional jealousy. Verse 24. Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. The officers bound Jesus and dragged him to Caiaphas the high priest. Caiaphas' house was right next to Annas' house. Jesus' time. Verse 25. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, You also are not one of his disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I am not. Peter stood with the crowd warming himself. Someone asked him, You also are not one of his disciples, are you? It was at this time when Peter denied Jesus a second time. Verses 26 to 27. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, Did I not see you in the garden with him? Peter again denied it and at once a rooster crowed. Peter cut off Malchus' ear. Malchus' relative remembered Peter and spoke disadvantage. He said, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter denied Jesus again. This was the third time he denied Jesus. The rooster crowed at once. Hearing the rooster crow, Peter remembered Jesus' words. Jesus said to Peter, "You will deny me 3 times." Remembering these words, Peter went outside and wept. Mark chapter 14 verses 71 and 72. Matthew chapter 26 verse 75. Verse 28. Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters, so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. Caiaphas the high priest questioned Jesus. Afterwards, in the morning, Jesus to Pilate's headquarters. The headquarters was the place where the governor judged. The Jews desired to eat the Passover feast. For this reason, they didn't enter the governor's headquarters. They believed they would be defiled if they entered. These people stressed the observance of such rules and rituals. As they observed these laws, they rejected Jesus and attempted to kill him. Adhering to rituals and to the system does not lead to life. Corrupt religion leads to ritualism. We need to follow the truth and the work of life. Verse 29. So Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" The Pharisees, who did not enter the headquarters, went outside and asked them, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" Verses 30 to 31. They answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." The Jews could not identify Jesus' sin, but they argued that Jesus did evil. They could not clearly say that Jesus sinned. They simply said that he did evil. The Jews said, "We are delivering him over to you because he does evil." But Pilate knew that Jesus was without sin. Luke chapter 23 verse 14, John chapter 18 verse 38. Pilate already knew that the Jews, in their envy, arrested Jesus in Matthew chapter 27 verse 18, Mark chapter 15 verse 10. That is why Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews replied, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." corrupt religious men borrowed the strength of a foreign nation's government to kill the Lord of life. Verse 32. This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken, to show by what kind of death he was going to die. The religious authorities were trying to kill Jesus by using envy and compulsion to arouse the public. However, the truth was that Jesus had prophesied in the Bible the kind of death he was going to die. Jesus was to be killed as the Bible prophesied. Scripture was to be fulfilled as it was written. Chapter 14, chapter 12, verse 31. Jesus came to die on the cross. He died as the Bible said he would, and he rose from the dead as the Bible said he would. Everything that happens is part of God's plan. God's will is being fulfilled. Verse 33. So Pilate entered his headquarters again, and called Jesus, and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" The Jews accused Jesus of attempting to be the king of the Jews. Luke chapter 23, verse 1. Pilate bound Jesus up and asked him if he is the king of the Jews. Verses 34 to 35. Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord? Or did others say it to you about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the Jews over to me. What have you done?" Jesus asked Pilate, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" There are two kinds of kings: the worldly king and the spiritual king. Jesus wanted to know which king Pilate was talking about. If Pilate was asking this of his own accord, he would be asking if Jesus is the worldly king, to which Jesus was going to say no. But if the Jews had told Pilate to ask this, Jesus was going to answer the question about the spiritual king. Pilate said that the Jews had told him to ask this. Hearing this, Jesus responded that he is the king of the Jews, and he described the personality of this king. Verse 36, Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world." Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. It is not a physical kingdom of the world. Jesus' kingdom is God's kingdom, which is part of the spiritual world. Jesus is the king of the spiritual kingdom, the king of heaven, the king of the universe, and the king of all believers. The Lord is the spiritual king. He is the spiritual king of the Jews. Thus, Jesus is not the king of the flesh, which is of this world. That is why he said that his kingdom is not of this world. Jesus' kingdom is not of the world. He does not fight with flesh and blood. The Lord is the spiritual king, fights the devil and wins. Jesus defeats sin and death. Verse 37. Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate did not know the spiritual world. He did not know about the spiritual king. He did not understand Jesus' explanation. That is why he asked, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered clearly, "You say that I am a king." Jesus is the spiritual king. He came to save us. He came to fulfill his calling as the Messiah. He is the bears witness the truth. He is the king of the people who follow the truth. The Lord is the king of us, chosen people. Therefore, we must believe in Jesus and be ruled by him. Jesus came to bear witness about the truth. We believers of Jesus are of the truth. We follow the truth. That is why believers understand the word of the Lord and obey. Verse 38. Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" After he had said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, "I find no guilt in him." Pilate asked Jesus, "What is truth?" He did not know about the truth. He did not know Jesus. Pilate, judging according to the law of the world, saw that Jesus was without sin, and he said, "I find no guilt in him." Pilate first declared that Jesus was not guilty. Verse 39. "But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So, do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" There was the custom of releasing one prisoner during the big feasts. The custom of releasing prisoners on certain holidays exists in some of today's nations as well. Pilate wanted to release Jesus on this Passover. That is why he asked the people. Pilate, in his sovereignty, could have released Jesus. Although Pilate declared Jesus innocent, he could not release him. This is because Pilate wanted to come to an agreement with the public. He did not follow the law or the truth. He followed the sentiment. Therefore, it could not have been a fair trial. Verse 40. They cried out again, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. Upon hearing Pilate, the crowd shouted for Barabbas to be released. The crowd wanted Jesus to be nailed to a cross. Mark chapter 15, verses 6 to 15. Jesus was without sin. However, the crowd shouted for Jesus to be nailed to a cross like a murderer or a thief. The crowd was evil and cruel. In this way, the Jews, in their jealousy, desired to kill Jesus. Here, Pilate did not make the right judgment. He did not judge according to the law. Rather, he listened to public sentiment. He released the robber Barabbas. Pilate announced that Jesus nailed to the cross. This concludes the 16th lecture on the book of John. Thank you.